every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The night air in Burlington, Vermont, in early October, carries the first real promise of winter. It's sharp and clean, scented with decaying leaves, and the faint sweet smell of wood smoke from distant chimneys. It's a scent that promises cozy sweaters, homecoming games, and the quiet academic hum of a classic New England college town. On a Saturday night, this air is also filled with the sounds of life, music spilling from the doorways of the Church Street marketplace, laughter echoing off brick facades, the murmur of 1,000 conversations as students from the University of Vermont reclaim the city as their own. It's a landscape of perceived safety, a bubble of youthful energy and intellectual promise nestled against the deep, dark waters of Lake Champlain. But bubbles are, by their very nature, fragile. On the night of October 7, 2006, that bubble was pierced by a silence. It began with a missed connection, a friend not where she was supposed to be. Then came the unanswered phone calls, the growing knot of anxiety, and finally, the cold dread of a dawning realization as Sunday bled into Monday. A 21-year-old UVM senior named Michelle Gardner Quinn had vanished into that crisp autumn night. She was last seen as a fleeting image on a grainy security camera, a ghost in the machine, her final moments of freedom captured in silent grayscale pixels. Her disappearance would trigger one of the largest search operations in Vermont's history. A desperate race against time played out across wooded ravines and suburban streets. But the man she was last seen with would claim he was nothing more than a passing stranger, a good Samaritan who simply offered directions. He would have a story, an alibi, and a confident denial. He left no eyewitnesses to the crime that followed, and he offered no confession. He believed he had committed a perfect murder. He was wrong. He failed to account for the witnesses he could not see. The single strand of hair shed on a seat, the microscopic fibers of carpet transferred in the dark, the unique mineral signature of the soil carried away on a floor mat, and the invisible signals his phone cast into the night sky. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a forensic tapestry, a case where a killer was ensnared, not by a single piece of smoking gun evidence, but by an inescapable web of microscopic clues he unknowingly carried away with him, a silent chorus of witnesses that would ultimately speak for a young woman who could no longer speak for herself. Michelle Gardner Quinn was, by all accounts, a person drawn to the intricate connections of the natural world. She saw the planet not as a resource, but as a complex living system. Born in Falls Church, Virginia, she was a person of profound intellect and boundless curiosity. At 21, she was a senior at the University of Vermont, pursuing a challenging double major in environmental studies and Japanese. This combination wasn't an arbitrary choice. It reflected her holistic view of the world. She understood that environmental solutions required not just scientific knowledge, but cross-cultural communication and understanding. She was a scholar, but she was not confined to the library. Her true classroom was the world itself. Her passion for exploration had taken her far from the rolling hills of Vermont. She had spent time in Central America, studying tropical ecosystems in Costa Rica and working with local communities in Nicaragua. These were not tourist trips. They were immersive experiences. Friends recall her stories not of beaches and resorts, but of the people she met, the biodiversity she documented, and the environmental challenges she witnessed firsthand. She was fluent in Spanish, another tool in her quest to connect with and understand the world on a deeper level. She was a photographer, capturing the beauty of the places she visited, and a writer, filling journals with her observations. She was described universally as vibrant, kind, and fiercely independent, a young woman who radiated a quiet confidence and a powerful sense of purpose. Her father, Dan Gardner, a project manager for NASA, and her mother, Diane Quinn, a marketing executive, had raised a daughter who was both brilliant and deeply compassionate. With graduation on the horizon, her future was a landscape of limitless possibility. A career in international environmental policy, fieldwork in a remote part of the world, graduate school, all were within her grasp. Burlington was a perfect setting for the final chapter of her undergraduate life. The city's progressive, environmentally conscious culture mirrored her own values. She thrived at UVM, a campus known for its strong environmental programs. She was a dedicated student, but she also embraced the social fabric of college life. Like thousands of her peers, a Saturday night in the fall often meant heading downtown to the Church Street Marketplace, a pedestrian mall that serves as the city's social hub. The night of Saturday, October 7, 2006, began with this familiar ritual. It was a long holiday weekend for Columbus Day, and the city was alive with an end-of-week energy. Michelle met up with a group of friends. The plan was simple and timeless. Have a few drinks, share some laughs, and enjoy the freedom of a night with no classes the next morning. Their first stop was Rasputin's, a popular downtown bar known for its lively atmosphere. As the evening progressed, the group navigated the crowded bar scene, and in the way that large groups often do, they began to fragment. Michelle and a friend, Kara, broke off and made their way to another spot, JP's Pub. They stayed there until closing time, around 2 a.m. As the lights came up and patrons spilled out onto the street, a moment of miscommunication occurred. Kara believed Michelle was getting a ride with another acquaintance. Michelle, perhaps, thought the same of Kara. In the confusion of the post-bar exodus, they became separated. Michelle soon realized she was alone. Her friends were gone, and to make matters worse, her cell phone battery was dead, cutting off her most direct link to them. Faced with a walk of just over a mile back to her residence hall on UVM's Trinity campus, Michelle began to make her way through the emptying streets. The boisterous energy of midnight had given way to the quieter, more solitary atmosphere of the early morning hours. It was in this moment of vulnerability, standing on the corner of Church and Main Street, one of the city's central intersections, that her path fatefully crossed with that of Brian Rooney. A security camera mounted on the exterior of a jewelry store, its unblinking eye recording the quiet rhythms of the city, captured their meeting. The footage, devoid of sound, is haunting in its banality. It shows Michelle, identifiable by her clothing, looking down at her useless phone. A man, older and with a stocky build, approaches her. He is Brian Rooney. They appear to have a conversation. He gestures. She seems to listen. It is impossible to know what was said, what promises of help were offered, or what instincts were quieted. Crucially, another young man, a UVM student named Patrick Leduc, was also walking by. He would later become a key witness. He saw the two talking, and, according to his testimony, Rooney asked him if he had a cell phone Michelle could borrow. Leduc agreed. He handed his phone to Michelle. She dialed the number of her friend, Lisa, hoping to find a place to stay or a way back to campus. The call went to voicemail. Michelle handed the phone back to Leduc, and she and Rooney walked away together, disappearing from the camera's view. A few minutes later, Lisa, having seen the missed call from an unfamiliar number, called back. Patrick Leduc answered. He explained that a girl had just used his phone. Lisa, not sensing any immediate danger, went back to sleep. That brief, missed connection, that small series of seemingly insignificant events, marked the last time anyone who knew Michelle would have any contact with her. After that phone call, after she walked down the street with Brian Rooney, Michelle Gardner Quinn vanished. The first 24 hours of a missing person case are the most critical. When Sunday came and went with no word from Michelle, her friend's initial assumption that she had simply stayed with someone else began to give way to a growing unease. It was completely out of character for her to be out of touch for so long. She was responsible, always checking in. By Monday morning, the unease had blossomed into full-blown fear. Her friends contacted her resident advisor, who, following protocol, notified the University of Vermont police. The official search for Michelle Gardner Quinn had begun. The initial investigation moved with the urgency that a student's disappearance demands. UVM police and the Burlington Police Department coordinated efforts, quickly establishing a timeline of her last known movements. They spoke to the friends she had been with, piecing together the events of Saturday night. The story led them to the bars, the separation, and the report of her dead phone. The most significant early lead came from her friend Lisa, who reported the strange missed call from an unknown number. This was the first concrete clue investigators had. They traced the number to Patrick Leduc. When detectives located and interviewed Leduc, the focus of the investigation sharpened dramatically. He recounted the late-night encounter on Church and Main, describing the young woman who seemed lost and the older, heavy-set man who was with her. He had handed over his phone, seen her make the call, and watched them walk off together. He provided a physical description of the man. This crucial testimony led investigators to begin canvassing businesses in the area for security footage. They got a hit at Lipa's jewelry store. The grainy black-and-white video confirmed Leduc's story. There was Michelle, and there was the man. The image gave them a face, indistinct, but a face nonetheless. It was a chilling artifact, the last recorded image of Michelle alive and free. Recognizing the urgent need for public assistance, the Burlington Police Department made the critical decision to release a still frame from the security video to the media. The face of the mystery man was broadcast on local news and published in newspapers across the state. The tip line began to ring. One call, however, stood out. A woman called in, her voice heavy with certainty. She recognized the man in the picture. It was her ex-husband, Brian Rooney. Brian Rooney was 36 years old, a construction worker, who lived in a small apartment in the nearby town of Richmond. He was known to plow snow during the winter to supplement his income. On the surface, he was an ordinary blue-collar guy, but his history was anything but ordinary. A background check revealed a significant and disturbing criminal record. In 1993, Rooney had been convicted of sexual assault in a case that shared some unsettling parallels with Michelle's disappearance. In that incident, he had offered a ride to a woman, driven her to a secluded area, and assaulted her. He was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in prison and was on the sex offender registry. This information immediately transformed him from a person of interest into the prime suspect. On Monday, October 9th, just 2 days after Michelle was last seen, detectives from the Burlington Police Department located Brian Rooney and brought him in for questioning. The interview, conducted by lead investigators, including Detective Sergeant Richard Svekas, was a study in deception. Rooney presented himself as calm, helpful, and entirely unconcerned. He readily admitted to being the man in the video. He told the detectives that he had been in Burlington that night, celebrating a friend's birthday. He claimed he saw Michelle on the street corner, noticed she was alone, and looked upset, and approached her as a good Samaritan. He confirmed the story about the dead cell phone and borrowing Patrick Leduc's phone. But this is where his version of events diverged sharply from the evidence police would later uncover. According to Rooney, after Michelle made the call, he simply pointed her in the direction of the UVM campus. He claimed they went their separate ways right there on the street. He told detectives that he then walked to his blue Chevrolet S10 pickup truck, which he claimed was parked in a nearby lot, and drove straight home to Richmond. He was adamant that he had no further contact with her. But his story was riddled with subtle inconsistencies and outright lies. The most significant was his claim that his own cell phone had been dead that night, a convenient excuse for why Michelle would have needed to borrow a stranger's phone instead of his. Detectives were immediately suspicious. His story was too neat, and his calm demeanor felt unnatural for someone who had just learned he was the last person seen with a missing young woman. While Rooney was spinning his tale, the search for Michelle was escalating into a massive operation. Her disappearance had seized the community's heart. Hundreds of volunteers, students, faculty, and local residents fanned out across the city and into the surrounding countryside. The Vermont National Guard was called in to assist, providing logistical support and manpower. The search became the top story in the state, a constant presence on television and in the news. Leading the public face of this effort was Michelle's father, Dan Gardner. He and Michelle's mother, Diane, had flown in immediately. Dan, applying the systematic, data-driven approach he used as a project manager for NASA's Hubble Space Telescope program, became an integral part of the search organization. He worked with law enforcement to create detailed search grids using GPS technology and mapping software, ensuring that the volunteer effort was methodical and thorough, not just a desperate, random sweep. His calm, articulate, and determined presence in media interviews galvanized the community and kept Michelle's story at the forefront of everyone's minds. He was a father, channeling his grief into action, refusing to give up hope. Meanwhile, investigators, deeply skeptical of Rooney's story, moved to secure warrants. Based on his criminal history and the circumstances of the disappearance, they had enough for a judge to sign off on searches of his apartment in Richmond, his Chevrolet S10 pickup, and his person to collect DNA samples. As the forensics team began the meticulous work of processing Rooney's truck, bagging and tagging every potential piece of evidence, the searchers continued their grim work. The days ticked by, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. With each passing day, the hope that had fueled the initial search began to wane, replaced by a grim, collective foreboding. The question was no longer just where is Michelle, but what had happened to her. On Friday, October 13th, 6 days after Michelle Gardner Quinn disappeared, the search came to its heartbreaking conclusion. A man was hiking with his dog along a rugged, wooded trail near Huntington Gorge, a scenic but treacherous area known for its steep cliffs and rushing water. The location was remote, about 15 miles southeast of Burlington, and critically only a few miles from Brian Rooney's home in Richmond. There, off the main path, the hiker's dog alerted him to something. Partially concealed beneath a blanket of autumn leaves and forest debris lay the body of a young woman. Law enforcement was called to the scene, and the victim was soon identified. It was Michelle. The discovery transformed the area into a major crime scene. The Vermont State Police Crime Scene Investigation Unit cordoned off the gorge, beginning the painstaking process of documenting and collecting evidence. The location itself was significant. It was not a place one happens upon by accident. It was secluded, difficult to access, and far from where Michelle was last seen. The choice of this location suggested premeditation and a desire to conceal the crime. An autopsy would later confirm the community's worst fears. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. The medical examiner also found clear evidence of sexual assault. The brutal nature of the murder sent a shockwave of grief and anger through Vermont. For investigators, the tragic discovery was also a critical turning point. They now had a primary and secondary crime scene, the place of abduction and the dump site, and a body that held its own forensic story. While Brian Rooney had left no human witnesses, he had failed to account for the silent testimony of trace evidence. The forensic investigation that followed would become a textbook example of how a collection of seemingly insignificant microscopic clues can be woven together to create an irrefutable narrative of guilt. It began with the evidence collected from Rooney's blue Chevy S10 pickup truck, which had been impounded days earlier. The interior of the truck was a treasure trove for the forensics team. They found several long, dark hairs on the passenger seat and floor. Under a microscope, these hairs were determined to be human and were consistent with Michelle's hair color and type. Subsequent mitochondrial DNA analysis conclusively matched them to Michelle Gardner Quinn. This was the first piece of physical evidence that unequivocally placed her inside Rooney's truck, shattering his claim that they had only spoken on the street. The science behind this is rooted in Locard's exchange principle, a cornerstone of forensic science which posits that the perpetrator of a crime will bring something into the crime scene and leave with something from it. This two-way transfer was evident when technicians examined the clothing Michelle was wearing when her body was found. Adhering to her distinctive jacket were several blue synthetic fibers. Forensic scientists analyzed these fibers using comparison microscopy and chemical analysis. They then took samples from the worn blue carpeting inside Rooney's pickup truck. The fibers were a perfect match in all identifiable characteristics: color, composition, diameter, and signs of wear. This reciprocal evidence, Michelle's hair in his truck's fibers on her jacket, created a powerful, silent link between the victim, the suspect, and the vehicle used in the commission of the crime. But the defense could still argue that this evidence only proved Michelle had been given a ride, not that Rooney had murdered her. The prosecution needed something to tie Rooney directly to the remote gorge where her body was found. The key to this would be found not in biology, but in geology. Investigators had meticulously vacuumed every inch of Rooney's truck, paying special attention to the driver's side floor mat, the area around the gas and brake pedals, and the wheel wells. They collected samples of soil, dust, and rock fragments. These samples were sent to Dr. Jane Selverston, a professor of geology and a petrology expert at the University of Vermont. Her task was to analyze the mineral composition of the debris to see if it could be traced to a specific geographic location. Dr. Selverston's analysis uncovered something remarkable. The soil from Rooney's truck contained a very specific and unusual combination of minerals, most notably a type of metamorphic rock called garnet schist. This rock is characterized by its silvery mica matrix, within which are embedded distinctive reddish-pink garnet crystals. Dr. Selverston, an expert on the geology of the region, knew that this specific type of rock, part of a geological feature known as the Camel's Hump Formation, is not found everywhere in Vermont. It outcrops in very specific and mappable locations. she began a methodical process of creating what she would later call a geological alibi. She collected soil samples from every location associated with Rooney's story. The streets of downtown Burlington where he met Michelle, the parking lot where he claimed his truck was, his apartment complex in Richmond, and the construction site where he worked. She analyzed them all. None contained the unique garnet schist found in his truck. Then she traveled to Huntington Gorge. She took soil and rock samples from the dirt path leading to the exact spot where Michelle's body had been discovered. She took these samples back to her lab and prepared thin sections of the rock fragments, grinding them down until they were thin enough for light to pass through. Under a petrographic microscope, she could identify the precise mineral content and structure. The results were stunning. The mineralogical fingerprint of the soil from the gorge was a perfect match to the soil found on Brian Rooney's floor mat. The combination of quartz, muscovite, biotite, and the distinctive garnet crystals was identical. Rooney had, quite literally, carried the crime scene away with him on the bottom of his shoes, providing a direct physical link between his vehicle and the dump site. But the web of evidence was still growing. As crime scene technicians conducted a grid search of the area around Michelle's body, a small object glinted in the autumn sunlight. It was a small, silver-colored plastic buckle, the kind used to tighten a ski boot. It seemed out of place in the woods in early October. The buckle was collected and catalogued. Later, when detectives executed a search warrant on a storage unit rented by Brian Rooney, they found what they were looking for: a pair of ski boots. One of the boots was missing an identical buckle from its strap. The buckle from the crime scene was not just visually similar. It was a perfect physical match, fitting precisely into the empty slot on the boot. It was another small, damning piece of physical evidence connecting Rooney to the exact spot where Michelle's body lay. And finally, there was the digital evidence from his cell phone. Rooney's lie that his phone battery had been dead that night proved to be his undoing. Investigators subpoenaed his cell phone records from Verizon Wireless. The records told a story of his movements that night, a story told by the invisible handshakes between his phone and the network's cell towers. The data showed his phone was not only on, but actively communicating with the network. By analyzing the sequence of cell towers his phone pinged throughout the night, investigators could map a rough trajectory of his travel. The data showed his phone moving from the downtown Burlington area shortly after 2:30 a.m., heading south on Interstate 89. It then pinged off towers in the geographical area that covered Richmond and the Huntington Gorge. The phone remained in that area for a period of time before the data showed it moving back north towards Burlington in the early morning hours, and then finally back to the Richmond area where he lived. This digital trail completely obliterated his alibi that he had driven straight home. It provided a timeline that corroborated the abduction, the time needed to commit the murder, and the subsequent return journey. DNA, fibers, soil, a buckle, and cell phone data, each piece a single thread, but when woven together, they created an unbreakable forensic tapestry. With this overwhelming cascade of forensic evidence, Chittenden County State's Attorney T.J. Donovan was convinced he could secure a conviction. In November 2007, Brian Rooney was dressed and charged with the aggravated murder and sexual assault of Michelle Gardner Quinn. The case finally went to trial in the fall of 2008. The prosecution, led by Donovan, faced the challenge of presenting a case built entirely on circumstantial evidence. There were no eyewitnesses to the abduction, assault, or murder. There was no confession. Rooney had maintained his innocence from the moment he was questioned. The entire case rested on the jury's ability to understand and believe the story told by the microscopic evidence. In his opening statement, Donovan introduced a powerful and easily digestible metaphor to the jury. He told them that the state's evidence was like a glove. Each piece of forensic evidence, the DNA, the fibers, the soil from the gorge, the cell phone records, the ski boot buckle, represented a finger. Individually, each piece of evidence is a finger, he argued, but when you put them all together, they form a glove that fits one hand and one hand only, the hand of Brian Rooney. This framework was brilliant in its simplicity. It provided the jury with a mental model for how to assemble the complex scientific testimony they were about to hear, transforming it from a list of disparate facts into a single cohesive proof of guilt. The prosecution then began the methodical process of building that glove, finger by finger. They called a series of expert witnesses to the stand. A DNA analyst from the Vermont Forensic Laboratory testified about the mitochondrial DNA match of the hairs found in Rooney's truck to Michelle and the nuclear DNA match of Rooney's semen found on her body. Forensic chemists detailed the fiber analysis, explaining the concept of the two-way transfer and showing microscopic images of the matching blue carpet fibers. An FBI expert on cellular technology took the stand, using large maps to show the jury the cell tower locations and how Rooney's phone had traveled a path consistent with the crime, not his alibi. Perhaps the most dramatic and pivotal testimony came from Dr. Jane Selverston, the forensic geologist. On the stand, she was the calm, confident voice of scientific certainty. She explained the complex geology of the region in clear, accessible terms. She showed the jury maps of the Camel's Hump Formation and explained why the garnet schist was a unique geological marker. She detailed her methodical process of collecting and analyzing the alibi soil samples and how they all failed to match the soil from Rooney's truck. Then she presented her conclusion, that the soil on Rooney's floor mat could have only come from the Huntington Gorge area. Her testimony was groundbreaking for a Vermont courtroom and provided the undeniable link between Rooney's truck and the place he had left Michelle's body. The defense's cross-examination attempts to label her work as junk science fell flat against the weight of her academic credentials and the logical precision of her work. The defense, led by Public Defender David Slay, was faced with the monumental task of dismantling this forensic fortress. Their strategy was to create reasonable doubt by attacking each piece of evidence individually and offering an alternative, albeit speculative, narrative. Slay did not dispute that Rooney and Michelle had been together. The video and witness testimony made that impossible. Instead, he argued that the encounter was consensual, that Rooney had offered Michelle a ride, and they had parted ways amicably later on. He posited that some unknown third-party assailant was the one who had actually abducted and murdered her. It was a classic, some other guy did it, defense. Slay's team cross-examined each of the state's experts vigorously. They suggested the possibility of evidence contamination, arguing that Michelle's hairs could have been transferred to the truck via an intermediate source, or that lab procedures were flawed. They challenged the fiber evidence as being too common to be conclusive. They argued that cell tower data was imprecise and could not place Rooney at the exact location of the gorge, only in a general vicinity. They tried to portray the geological evidence as an unproven novelty. The defense was thorough in its attempts to poke holes, but they were unable to offer any compelling evidence to support their alternative theory. They could create theoretical possibilities of doubt, but they couldn't refute the sheer, overlapping weight of the prosecution's case. The glove simply had too many fingers. After weeks of testimony, both sides presented their closing arguments. The prosecution reiterated the glove metaphor, methodically summarizing how each piece of evidence interlocked to prove Rooney's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The defense argued that the state had built a case on assumptions and probabilities, not certainties, and that without a confession or an eyewitness, there was enough doubt to acquit. The case then went to the jury. They were tasked with sifting through the weeks of complex scientific testimony and deciding the fate of Brian Rooney. Their deliberation was surprisingly swift. After less than 5 hours, they sent a note to the judge. They had reached a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. Brian Rooney stood at the defense table, his face a mask of indifference. The jury foreman handed the verdict to the clerk, who read it aloud. On the charge of aggravated murder, we the jury find the defendant, Brian Rooney, guilty. Another guilty followed, for the charge of sexual assault. Rooney displayed no visible emotion. Michelle's family, who had sat through every gut-wrenching day of the trial, wept silently. At his sentencing hearing, Rooney continued to maintain his innocence, but the judge, citing the brutal and predatory nature of the crime, sentenced him to the maximum penalty under Vermont law, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction of Brian Rooney brought a legal conclusion to the murder of Michelle Gardner Quinn. A predator was removed from society, sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in prison for the brutal and senseless act he committed. For Michelle's family, her friends, and the entire Burlington community that had been so deeply scarred by her loss, the verdict provided a measure of justice. Though it could never erase the profound pain of her absence, the case left an indelible mark on the state of Vermont, a stark reminder that such darkness can exist even in the most idyllic of places, and it ushered in a new era of respect for the power of forensic geology in criminal investigations. In the final analysis, the anatomy of this case was the anatomy of accumulation. It was not defined by a single, dramatic moment of discovery in an interrogation room or a surprise witness taking the stand. Instead, its skeletal structure was built from the patient layering of scientific fact upon scientific fact, trace evidence upon trace evidence. It was a case solved by the quiet, diligent work of people in laboratories, peering through microscopes, sifting through dust, and analyzing the chemical composition of microscopic fibers. It was solved by a geologist who understood that the very earth beneath our feet tells a story, and that a sample of soil can be as damning as a bloody fingerprint. It was a definitive demonstration that in the modern age of investigation, a killer's attempt to conceal his crime is often fatally undermined by the very environment in which he commits it. Brian Rooney believed he was moving through the night unseen. He spoke to no one who could testify against him, and he chose a victim who was alone and vulnerable. He left her in a place where he thought she would be lost to the elements, and he constructed a simple, plausible story to tell the police. Confident in his ability to deceive, he thought he had controlled the narrative. What he failed to comprehend was that he was never truly alone. He was accompanied by the immutable laws of physics and biology, by the fundamental principles of forensic science that state every contact, no matter how fleeting, leaves a trace. He was trailed by the invisible signals his phone cast out, by the microscopic rock fragments that clung to the soles of his shoes, and by the single strands of his victim's hair that settled silently in his truck. These were the unseen witnesses to his crime, a chorus that could not be intimidated and could not be deceived. Brian Rooney tried to erase Michelle Gardner Quinn, to reduce her vibrant life to a secret buried in a ravine. But he failed, because every contact leaves a trace, and the earth itself bore witness. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.